If John the Apostle were preaching this morning, he'd say, okay, that's the message, let's go. But unfortunately for you guys, I'm with you today, and we're in the story chapter 25, which is in Mark chapter 8 for us today. If you have a Bible, turn to Mark chapter 8, and we'll be there in just a moment. It's good to see my good friend Roger Davis with us today, back here in the back. Also want you to know that Sarah Goodpasture's sister is with us. She's a dear friend of mine from Texas, Sue Allen Chalk. We're honored to have her with us today as well. And then I did want to mention that Nick Boone was honored on Wednesday at Lipscomb Academy for Lifetime Achievement as an alumnus of Lipscomb Academy, as was his brother Pat. And I didn't know that Nick was going to bring his brother Pat with him today, but it's good to have Nick and Pat Boone with us, who were honored at the Academy on Wednesday this week. So this morning, I want to remind you of something that we've been looking at. This is called an icon. It's a picture. These pictures were very important in the life of the church in a pre-literate society. Before people could read and write, what priests and ministers would do would be to take people and show them pictures like this and ask them what they see and talk about the great Christian principles of faith that are found in the picture. And you might remember that I showed you the halos over the heads of both Jesus and Mary in this picture, and I tried to remind you that the fullness of the Spirit of God came to reside in Jesus Christ. He was conceived in the Spirit, but at his baptism, it says he was anointed in the Spirit. And that same Spirit then is poured out upon us as the church. And we believe that what the Spirit touches, the Spirit changes. Going back to that picture, you might remember that I asked you to focus upon the hands that you see in this picture. Mary's hand reminds us that there are 4 Gospels, but one story. And it's interesting, as we're reading through the story, we're finding that various scenes are coming from Matthew or Mark, Luke, or John, but they're all part of this same story about Jesus the Christ. In Jesus' hand, we see 2 fingers up and 3 fingers down and connected, and I tried to remind you that that demonstrates the 2 great truths that the early church talked about for centuries. One of those is the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 yet one. And then the other is the 2 fingers up that remind us that when we look at Jesus, we're looking at one who is fully God and fully man at the same time. Jesus is fully God and fully man in all that he does. Then I asked you to look at the other hand of Jesus, and you see that he's holding a scroll, which represents the Word or the Logos of God. And I tried to remind you that when the Holy Spirit came down in the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit, the fullness of God, came and resided inside the tabernacle. But what John tells us is that the fullness of the Spirit came down and tabernacled inside of Jesus the Christ. So that the words of Jesus are the very words of God. The wisdom of God is given to us through the person of Jesus. If you want to know what God has to say to you, listen to Jesus, because it's through Jesus that the Word is announced to us. And so we see all of this working in our little picture. But today I want to notice that Jesus is wearing gold. Why is he wearing gold? Well, because he was born a king. Now, I do have to admit that I grew up going to church. I've been going to church since I was old enough to leave the hospital. But when I got off to college, I will have to admit that I missed it on something. I did not know that Christ was not Jesus' last name, okay? I mean, I'm like, Jesus Christ, everybody's got a last name. It's Jesus, and his last name is Christ. And then I got off to college, and they were like, no, Jesus' last name would have been Ben Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. Christ was the title for Jesus. And I was like, oh, okay, well, what does Christ mean? And then I began to realize, oh, Christ means king or anointed one. Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah or anointed. So when we say Jesus Christ, what we are announcing is that Jesus is King. One of the great things that I think is kind of creeping into the church is that we're starting to call Jesus King Jesus again, because that's what he is. To say Jesus Christ is to say King Jesus, that he is the one who reigns and rules. Jesus is the Messiah, the King. And so today in Mark chapter 8, I want us to understand this challenge of Jesus being a king and what does that really mean. And to begin with, I want to take you to some material that's right before where our reading picks up in chapter 25. Jesus heals a blind man. And if you read in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 22, it reads like this. Jesus took the blind man by the hand. He led him outside the village, putting spittle on his eyes. That's a polite way of saying Jesus spit and put it on his eyes. His hands and made and asked, "Do you see anything?" And looking up, the man replied, "I see people like trees walking around." So Jesus heals a guy. And what the guy who's blind now sees is this blurry picture that kind of makes people look like trees. So, it tells us then he laid hands on the man's eyes a second time, and he saw everything clearly. So I always ask my students, why did Jesus have to heal the man twice? And there's possibilities for this. You know, was it just a whoops? My bad? Oh, take two? Should he have stayed at a Holiday Inn Select the night before and he didn't? I mean, does everybody just have a bad day? What's going on in this story? You see, I think we have to think about what's going on there. And was this something where Jesus was having an off day, or was this way of healing the blind man supposed to help us to appreciate the challenge that each one of us has as well? You see, it says Jesus put his hands on the man a second time. Then his eyes were open, restored, and he began to see clearly. And what I want us to notice is that sometimes we don't see certain things until we're ready to see them in a certain way. Sometimes we may get the right word and the wrong concept. We may think we understand something, but we don't understand it fully. We may think that the way that we see the world is clear, but God may think we're seeing the world like people who look like trees walking around. And so what I want us to notice as you're reading through Mark chapter 8 is that immediately after this story about the blind man who is healed in two stages, we come to verse 27. And this becomes a pivotal piece in Mark's gospel. If I was only going to preach two sermons from the Gospel of Mark, this would be the first one. Mark 8, beginning in verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi, north of the Sea of Galilee. And on the way, he asked, "Who do people say that I am?" It's like everybody who is political in some way wants to know, what are the public opinion polls saying about me? What are you hearing? And they say, well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say you're Elijah. Some people say you're one of the prophets. And then Jesus said, yeah, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter stepped forward and boldly said, you are the Messiah. You are the King. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Let's unpack this for just a moment. Jesus asked, who do people say that I am? And he got all kinds of answers. And then he said, but what about you? And Peter got the words right. You are the Messiah, the King, the Anointed One, the one that God promised to Abraham, the one that Moses said would be a prophet like me who would come after me, the one from the lineage of David. Peter's saying, you're that person, a Messiah, an Anointed One, the King, the long-awaited hope of Israel. Peter was saying, Jesus, you are what we have been waiting for. But then Jesus said, shh, don't tell anybody. We call this the messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark. That Jesus didn't want the apostles to go around and tell anybody who he was. Why? Because sometimes we get the words right. We get the concept wrong. Sometimes we think we see clearly, and what we really see are people like trees walking around. And so, look in verse 31, still in chapter 8. Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Notice verse 32. He was stating this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. In Mark's gospel, this is where scene 2 begins. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer. You see, the first half of the gospel, Jesus is trying to make sure that they understand that he is the Messiah. By his teaching, by his life, by his miracles, he wanted to make sure that they understood without a doubt that he is the Messiah. Now, in scene 2, he wants to show them what kind of a Messiah I am going to be. And he introduces this term, Son of Man, to describe himself. Son of Man becomes Jesus' favorite way of speaking about himself, to call himself the Son of Man. And because we're Old Testament scholars and because we paid attention when we were reading through the story in the Old Testament, we remember that the Son of Man is a concept that pops up in Daniel, but really not much after that. In Daniel chapter 7, we read these words, behold, the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And what Israel knew is, whatever Daniel was talking about there in the Old Testament, when he used this phrase, Son of Man, it was some kind of a messianic phrase. Son of Man. It was some way looking forward to the time when the Anointed One, the Promised One of God would come. And so now Jesus grabs this title, Son of Man, and uses it for himself. I try to tell my students in the story of Jesus that the Son of Man was an empty container, a messianic empty container in which Jesus could place what he wanted people to understand about himself. And you see, what Israel thought was that there were going to be two people that came at the time of the Messiah. The first who would come would be a suffering servant. It would be the figure that's mentioned several times in the book of Isaiah, and especially in chapter 53. That this suffering servant's going to come and going to take all the sins of the people upon himself. That was one person, the scapegoat. The other person was going to be the deliverer, the king, the anointed one. And they were looking for these two figures to come, and what Jesus announced through this passage is that as Son of Man, Jesus was announcing that I am the Messiah and the suffering servant. And I'm both. And when Jesus announces that he is a king who will suffer, the disciples, especially Peter, don't know what to do with that. They spent 3 years following after Jesus, knowing he was going to be a king. They're ready to fight for him. They're ready to drive the Romans out of Jerusalem. They're ready to set up an earthly kingdom. They're ready for their place in this government that he is going to set up. And so Peter takes Jesus aside and says, you need to cut it out with that kind of talk. I've got everybody ready to fight for you, to die for you. How dare you start talking about going to Jerusalem and suffering and a cross and all this. And I mean, Peter is just letting him have it. And Jesus turns and rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan, because you don't understand what I'm here about. And then he calls everybody who's around and says, hey, everybody, please come here. I need to tell you something. It's really important. Gather around. He called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, listen up. If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up a cross, and follow me. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for you to gain the whole world and forfeit your soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words, the words I just pronounced, in his adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with all of his holy angels. Jesus says, if you want to come after me, deny yourself, take up a cross, follow me. If you want to save your life, you'll lose it. If you'll lose it for me, you'll save it. There's 3 actions that we read just clearly in this passage. If you really want to follow after King Jesus, you got to deny yourself. Pick up a cross and follow him. If I was going to explain that, I would say that the way of Jesus is the way of self-denial. It's not giving in to all the gratification and the pleasures that you want. It's not about putting your needs first. It's not about self-gratification. It's about self-denial. Picking up a cross is about sacrificing your life for the lives of other people. It's about giving of yourself in whatever ways God calls you to in order to be a servant of King Jesus and to make a difference in the lives of other people. And it's about self-discovery, but not the kind of self-discovery that says, I'm going to go out and try whatever I want, do whatever I want, live a free life until I discover what life's about. No, self-discovery by following in the footsteps of Jesus and discovering that the purpose of your life is to look as much like Jesus as you possibly can. The greatest joy that you'll find in life is to follow after Jesus, to be changed by Jesus, and join in the mission of Jesus. Jesus makes it very clear. If you want to follow after me, you got to deny yourself. You got to pick up a cross, and you got to follow. If we read a little bit more, here's the point that I want you to get today. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give your life for King Jesus and the gospel, you'll save it. In Mark chapter 9, the next chapter over, Jesus came to Capernaum and he asked, hey, disciples, what is it that y'all were talking about all along the road? They kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves as to who would be the greatest. And so Jesus said, hey, you're playing the comparison game, aren't you? You're playing king of the mountain. You're trying to figure out who's going to get the best seats in my government. You're trying to figure out who's going to be the top dog. And he sat down, called the 12, and said, if anyone wants to be first, he should be the servant of all. You see, Jesus teaches us that the way of King Jesus is the way of downward mobility in an upward mobility world. It's to try to think about, how can I be the servant of all? It's about walking into the lunchroom and figuring out not where's the best seat I can find at the table, but where's the place where I can make the most difference in the life of somebody else. It's about thinking about, how can I be the servant of other people? How can I be the blessing that other people need? I've got to put other people before myself. Then in the next chapter, Mark chapter 10, we read the story about Mrs. Zebedee. Everybody loves Mrs. Zebedee. Everybody knows of Mrs. Zebedee. Mrs. Zebedee comes to Jesus behind the back of all the other disciples, the apostles. And she comes to Jesus and she says, hey, Jesus, can we chat? Come here. So Jesus comes over, yes, ma'am, Miss Zebedee. What can I do for you? And Miss Zebedee says, now, Jesus, I know that my two boys are your favorites, because they've told me that whenever you take 3 to go do special stuff, you always bring my boys along. And I just know that one of them should be vice president and one of them should be secretary of state when you start your kingdom. Can't you just do that for them? And Jesus says, it's not for me to announce who will be on my right and who will be on my left when I come in glory. Are you sure those are the places that you want for them? But when the other disciples heard the end run that Mrs. Zebedee had made, it says that they were indignant. They were angry. And Jesus gathered his disciples again, and he said, the Gentiles, they crave the best positions and they lord their authority over one another. Not so with you. You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, he said, and when people get a little power, how quickly it goes to their heads. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be a slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not be served, and to give away his life in exchange for many who are held hostage. Many people ask, what is the key or the theme verse of the entire Gospel of Mark? Many people say it's Mark 10, verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. What does King Jesus want from us? He wants us to understand that we have a blurred view of what power is really all about. We think power is what you lord over others and the way that you get to the top. But Jesus says, if you understand me and the way that I use power, it is to be the servant of all. It is about self-denial, self-sacrifice, and discovering your life purpose by following in the footsteps of King Jesus. Now, I want us to understand that what we did at our baptism was to deny ourselves and to announce Jesus is Lord. When we were buried in the waters of baptism, it was a dying to ourself and a rising to live in Jesus Christ. And as we walked out of the waters of baptism with the forgiveness of sin and the Holy Spirit in our life, we began a journey to follow Jesus, to be changed by Jesus, and to join in the mission of Jesus. If you haven't been baptized yet, you don't understand the way of Jesus. You need to give your life to him. But if you have, and you've been living a blurry life, it's time for us to remember that what Jesus calls us to is the life of self-denial, self-sacrifice, and following in the footsteps of Jesus. If we can minister to you in any way, that's why we're here and we're not in a hurry. We encourage you to come to the front as we stand and sing this song together.